McGraw-Hill, Living with Art, 13th edition, Part 5, Chapter 14, Ancient Mediterranean Worlds. Chapter outline: the oldest art, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Aegean, the classical world, Greece and Roman. The oldest art, Paleolithic art, featured sculpted female figures and paintings of animals, human hands, and abstract signs. Paleolithic art featured sculpted female figures and paintings of animals, human hands, and abstract signs, such as we saw earlier in the text in the paintings of the Chauvet Cave in France. A female statuette often serves as an emblem of prehistoric art made before history was written down. It is made of stone and was carved about 25,000 years ago in the era known as the Paleolithic period, or the Stone Age, and it was found near Willendorf, a town in present-day Austria. Less than 5 inches tall, a rounded figure is small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. Its face is obscured by a minutely detailed hairstyle that covers the entire head. The body's proportions are exaggerated. Skinny arms bend at the elbows to rest on a pair of heavy breasts. The ballooning midsection tapers down to the legs that end just below the knees. Numerous Paleolithic female statuettes have been found across a broad region, carved of wood, ivory, and stone, or modeled in clay. They were produced over a period of thousands of years and in a variety of styles. Scholars long assumed that they were fertility figures used in some symbolic way to encourage pregnancy and childbirth. Today, experts suggest that it is unlikely that a single explanation can account for all of them. The oldest art, Neolithic art, of which only a small fraction survived, reflects a sedentary lifestyle, including complex societies and agriculture. The most famous Neolithic architecture in Europe is Stonehenge, which is in England. At its height, Stonehenge consisted of several concentric circles of megaliths, or very large stones surrounded by a circular ditch. It was built in several phases beginning around 3000 BCE. The tallest circle, seen here on the left, consists of 30 upright megaliths, capped by a continuous ring of horizontal stones, an early example of post and lintel architecture. Weighing some 50 tons each, these stones were quarried many miles away and hauled to the site, laboriously shaped with stone hammers. The heel stone, seen on the right side of this photograph, was raised upright some distance away and may have been one of a pair of stones, although we do not know why Stonehenge's Neolithic builders dedicated such immense resources to this site. Recent archaeological research has confirmed that the monument marks a graveyard, possibly of a ruling dynasty. Other findings show that Stonehenge was part of a larger complex, perhaps dedicated to religious ritual. Tantalizing glimpses of everyday life in the Neolithic period on the southern edge of the Mediterranean survive in the rock paintings of Algeria in northern Africa. Today, which is part of the Sahara, the world's largest desert. At the time, these images were painted roughly between 5000 and 2000 BCE. The desert had not yet emerged. Instead, the region was a vast grassland, home to animals, plants, and the people we see depicted here, 5 women gathered near their cattle. Other images painted on the rock walls depict women harvesting grain or occupied with their children, men herding cattle, and the enclosures that may represent dwellings. The figures depict the essence of human and animal bodies in active poses, stylized silhouettes. They were painted on the rock wall in differing scales and without a single defined picture plane. Mesopotamia. Complex Mesopotamian societies developed along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian societies developed the cuneiform writing system. The first cities of Mesopotamia arose in the southernmost area, a region called Sumer, about 3400 BCE, some dozen Sumerian city-states, cities that ruled over their surrounding territories, had emerged. The Sumerians were the first people to leave not just artifacts, but also words. The wedge-shaped marks that they pressed into the damp clay to keep track of inventories and accounts developed over time into a writing system capable of recording language, called cuneiform, or a Latin word for wedge-shaped. It served as a writing system of the Mesopotamia for the next 3,000 years. By 2300 BCE, the Sumerian city-states had been conquered by their neighbors to the north, the Akkadians. Under their ruler, Sargon I, the Akkadians established the region's first empire. Although it crumbled quickly, the empire seems to have extended all the way from the shores of the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Sargon I's grandson, Naram-Sin, commemorated his victory over the Lalubi people of eastern Mesopotamia with the monumental stele of King Naram-Sin. It pictures the Akkadian king dressed in godlike regalia and striding confidently over the defeated soldiers. Hierarchy of scale makes him larger than both his soldiers and the enemy in order to show his importance. His idealized anatomy indicates his strength and political might, while the cuneiform text cut into the mountain recounts his victory. Mesopotamia. Sumerian ziggurats acted as symbolic mountains with temples on top. Lacking stone, the Sumerians built their cities of sun-dried brick using the load-bearing construction technique. The largest structure of a Sumerian city was the ziggurat, a monumental platform supporting a temple or shrine. The example illustrated here, partially restored but still missing its temple, was dedicated to the moon god Nana, the protective deity of the Sumerian city of Ur. In the flat land of Sumer, ziggurats were visible for miles. They elevated the temple to a symbolic mountaintop, a meeting place for heaven and earth, where the priest and priestesses communicated with the gods. Mesopotamia. Stylized Sumerian votive figures were placed in temples. The temples atop the Sumerian ziggurats also housed small figures. Placed by the faithful before an image of a god or goddess, these sculpted images substituted for their owners, offering prayers on their behalf. The figure seen here stands erect with hands clasped before his chest. His eyes are exaggerated in scale and inlaid with white shell and black stone to emphasize his attentiveness to his prayers. The rest of the body is abstracted into cylinders for the skirt and the arms, and a triangular wedge for the torso. The patterned symmetrical hair and beard and the incised fringe on the skirt contrast to the flat surface. Mesopotamia. Assyrian palace sculpture included human-headed winged beasts, images of rulers and gods designed to impress visitors. Assyrian palace sculpture is a wall relief of an eagle-headed deity. This piece is from a ruler named Ashurnasirpal II, and it is placed in the front gates, and these are monumental stone slabs carved into enormous human-headed winged beasts, a bull and a lion. The lion, seen here, wears a horned cap indicating its divine status. Its body has 5 legs, so that from the front it appears motionless, but from the side it looks to be walking. Visitors to the citadel were meant to be impressed and no doubt intimidated by these majestic creatures. The walls of the same palace were lined with alabaster wall reliefs created in uniform to impress visitors. Mesopotamia. The Neo-Babylonian ruler Nebuchadnezzar created a planned city with monumental gates for ceremonies. When the Babylonians again came to power in Mesopotamia, late in the 7th century BCE, They formed a kingdom, now called Neo-Babylonia. These new Babylonians were great architects who developed the arch before the Romans did and were masters of decorative design for architecture. Like their forebearers, they had a formidable leader in the person of Nebuchadnezzar, a patron of the arts, who built a dazzling capital city at Babylon. A planned city, Babylon was constructed as a square bisected by the Euphrates River, with streets and broad avenues crossing at right angles. Because stone is scarce in this region of Mesopotamia, the architects made liberal use of glazed bricks. Babylon must have been a city of brilliant color. Its main thoroughfare was the processional way, at one end of which stood the Ishtar Gate, built about 575 BCE and now restored in a German museum. The gate consists of thousands of glazed mud bricks with two massive towers flanking the central arch. On ceremonial occasions, Nebuchadnezzar would sit under the arch to receive his subjects. The walls of the gate were embellished with registers of animals in low relief, lions, bulls, and mythological beasts, probably meant to be spirit guardians. Egypt. Egyptian art is known for its continuity, conservatism, and rigid organization. Egyptian art is known for its continuity, conservatism, and rigid organization. The Great Pyramids are the most recognizable symbols of ancient Egypt. Rising above the desert, these royal burials seem frozen in time, little changed by history, and they stand beside the Nile River and the modern city of Cairo. The principal message of Egyptian art is continuity, a seamless span of time reaching back into history and forward into the future. The Greek philosopher Plato wrote that Egyptian art did not change for 10,000 years. This was an exaggeration. Egyptian art did change over time. There were, however, many characteristics that remained stable over long periods. The ruler's image was one of them. Compare the portrait of King Menkaura, pictured with his queen around 2490 BCE, and the colossal portraits of Rameses II, sculpted about 1,200 years later. Both rulers have young, idealized bodies based on the Egyptian system of proportion. Their faces are almost identical, and neither shows any sign of age or weariness. Both stare straight ahead, motionless, despite Menkaura's slight step forward. Action was not important to Egyptian art. Order and stability reigned, as illustrated by the sculptures, strikingly logical and symmetrically balanced in their organization. Egyptian art is known for its continuity, conservatism, and rigid organization. Egypt. Egyptian ruler images are idealized and static and display symbols of office. Egyptian ruler images are idealized and static and they display symbols of office. They wear symbols of their office, a headdress, a kilt, and a false beard. The same attributes appear in the carved portrait of Queen Hatshepsut, one of the few female rulers in Egypt's history. Even when representing a female ruler, the desire for continuity dictated that the queen be represented as a man. Not only does she wear a headdress, kilt, and a false beard, but she also has a young, idealized male body. Egyptian ruler images are idealized and static and display symbols of office, such as in the burial mask of Tutankhamun. He wears the familiar regalia of office, with a cobra and a vulture symbols of the ancient protective goddess of Egypt. Egypt. Egyptians built funerary temples for their rulers and created art that focuses on the dead and the afterlife, especially the royal dead. Egyptians built funerary temples for their rulers and created art that focuses on the dead and the afterlife, as we can see in this image of the pyramids of Egypt. Egyptians built funerary temples for their rulers and created art that focused on the dead and on the afterlife. Glass was a luxury product in the ancient world. This bottle may have held perfume oils or pomegranate juice, which was appreciated as a beverage and also used for medicinal purposes. The red fruit filled with hundreds of edible garnet-colored seeds, the pomegranate hath been associated by many peoples with fertility and renewal. The ancient Egyptians included pomegranates and images of pomegranates in their burials to help promote rebirth in the afterlife. This little bottle, then, would have taken part in a rich network of associations that gave it meaning beyond its humble function. While once Egyptians built massive pyramids with adjacent funerary complexes for their deceased rulers, by Hatshepsut's day, royal burials were more discreet. Funerary temples, on the other hand, became majestic sites for the worship of their deceased ruler, who had rejoined with the gods in their immortality. Rising in a series of 3 broad terraces, the post and lintel temple here dedicated to Hatshepsut continues into the steep cliffs behind it, from which an interior sanctuary was hollowed out. More than 200 statues of the queen once populated this vast complex, which contains shrines to several Egyptian deities. Egyptian painting reveals the same clear visual design and illustrative skill as the works in stone. The Book of the Dead of Hunnefer is no exception. Painted on papyrus scrolls, the Book of the Dead were placed in burials to help the deceased journey into the afterlife. They contained spells and hymns and pictures, the dead person interacting with the gods. The scenes shown here, the scribe Hunnefer's heart is weighed by the jackal-headed god Anubis, as seen on the left. Hunnefer then walks with the falcon-headed god Horus to see the enthroned god Osiris. Hieroglyphic writing above the figures offer a spell. The work preserves conventions for Egyptian art. It is organized in registers with actions taking place along the ground line. There is no other reference to 3-dimensional space besides the overlapping body parts. When depicting an important personages, the Egyptian artist strove to show each part of the body to its best advantage so that it could be read clearly by the viewer. Thus, Hunnefer's lower body is seen in profile, his torso frontally, his head in the profile, but his eye frontally again. The poses are formal and rigid. One brief period in history of Egyptian culture stands apart from the rest and therefore has fascinated scholars and art lovers alike. This was the reign of a pharaoh named Amenhotep IV, who came to power about 1353 BCE. And for a civilization that prized continuity above all else, Amenhotep was a revolutionary. He changed his name to Akhenaten and attempted to establish a monotheism, or a belief in one god, among a people who traditionally worshipped many gods. And he built a new capital on what is now Tel el Amarna, so historians refer to his reign as the Amarna period. Akhenaten was apparently quite active in creating a new style of art for his reign, and under his direction, the rigid postures of Egyptian images, mostly of the royal images, gave way to a more relaxed and naturalistic and even more intimate portrayals. One brief period in history of Egyptian culture stands apart from the rest, and has therefore fascinated scholars and art lovers alike. It was the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten. Akhenaten was a revolutionary, and he actually tried to establish monotheism in Egypt, which is the belief in one god, and this was among a people who had traditionally worshipped many gods. He also gave quite active direction in creating a style of art for his reign. Under his direction, the rigid postures of Egyptian images of royalty gave way to a more relaxed and naturalistic and even intimate portrayals of royal life. In the domestic scene depicted in this limestone relief, Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti sit facing each other on cushions and thrones. Akhenaten tenderly holds one of their 3 daughters, who gestures towards her mother and sisters, seated on Nefertiti's lap. The older daughter looks up at her mother as she points across to her father. The youngest daughter tries to get her mother's attention by caressing her cheek. Above Akhenaten's god Aten, the sun disk shines his life-giving rays upon them. The sculpture is an example of a sunken relief. In this technique, the figures do not project upward from the surface. Instead, outlines are carved deep into the stone, and the figures are modeled within them from the surface down. Egypt. Conventions of Egyptian art include ground lines, registers, flat space, and formal poses combining side and frontal views for maximum information. Egypt. Egyptians used a grid-based system of proportion. If you look carefully at this design, you'll see the pencil marks of the grid as an example of how Egyptians used a grid-based system of proportions for the human body. Egypt. The Amarna period briefly changed the conventions of Egyptian art, among other changes. The Amarna period briefly changed the conventions of Egyptian art, among other changes. However, after the pharaoh Akhenaten's death, these changes didn't last. After his death, the temples to the old gods were restored, and those built to his god were dismantled. And the traditional Egyptian style of representation was reimposed. The Aegean. Aegean art is considered a precursor of ancient Greek art. The Aegean. The meaning and purpose of abstracted Cycladic figurines remains unknown. Between the Greek peninsula and present-day Turkey and Southwest Asia is an arm of the Mediterranean Sea known as the Aegean. Greek culture arose on the lands bordering this small sea within a sea, but the Greeks were preceded in the region by several cultures that thrived on the islands that are so plentiful there. The artistic cultures of the Aegean ran parallel to those of Egypt and Mesopotamia, for the earliest begins about 3000 BCE. There were three major Aegean cultures: the Cycladic, centered on a group of small islands in the Aegean, the Minoan, based on the island of Crete, and at the southern end of the Aegean was the Mysian, on the mainland of Greece. Cycladic art is a puzzle because we know almost nothing about the people who made it. It consists almost exclusively of figures like this one, simplified, abstracted, and composed of geometric lines and shapes. The figures vary in size from roughly 1.5 foot of this example to approximately life size, but they are much alike in style. Some play harps, but most stand still, with arms folded across the body. Found in burial settings, the figures suggest some sort of ritual use. They may be associated with fertility or represent a female deity. The Aegean. The Minoans built palaces decorated with images of athletes and sea life. Centered on the great city of Knossos, Minoan culture can be traced to about 3000 BCE. The culture's name comes from a legendary king called Minos, who supposedly ruled at Knossos and whose queen gave birth to the dreaded half-human and half-bull creature known as the Minotaur. The palace at Knossos features post and lintel construction with painted columns topped by pillow-like capitals. Numerous frescoes survive at Knossos, some fragmentary, some restored, and from these we have formed an impression of a culture that enjoyed games and sport. The fresco seen here pictures a charging bull in the landscape. Many curves, the bull's back and horns, and the rolling hills reinforce our experience of motion. Other murals feature acrobats leaping over bulls and servants carrying wine vessels, sea life, dancers, and landscapes. The Aegean. Mycenaeans built fortified palaces and are known for lavish burials filled with grave goods. The Mycenaeans built fortified palaces and are known for lavish burials filled with grave goods. Mycenaean culture, so called because it formed around the city of Mycenae, flourished on the southern coast of the Greek mainland from about 1600 to 1100 BCE. Like the Minoans, the Mycenaeans built palaces and temples, but they were also noted for their elaborate burial customs and tombs, a taste apparently acquired from the Egyptians, with whom they had contact. It seems probable that Egypt, or Nubia, was also the source of the Mycenaeans' supply of gold, for they were master goldsmiths. Burials in and around Mysia have yielded large quantities of exquisite gold objects, jewelry, cups, and adornments. One of the most spectacular works of art is a death mask, once thought to belong to a king, although the body it accompanied probably did not belong to this hero. The owner of this mask was undoubtedly someone important, buried in the circular complex of graves near the fortified palace at Mysia. The classical world. Greek representations of the human figure constantly changed from geometric abstraction to idealized naturalism and emotional and physical realism. Greek representations of the human figure constantly changed. One of many standard Greek pottery shapes, the kerator, was a vessel used for wine. This kerator dates from the 8th century BCE, when Greek culture first comes into focus. Stylistically, it belongs to the late geometric period, when human figures began to appear amid the geometric motifs that had decorated earlier Greek ceramics. In the upper register, a narrative scene of a funerary procession is depicted. The deceased is laid out on a four-legged couch. The checkerboard pattern above probably represents the textile that covered him. Wasp-waisted mourners stand to either side, slapping their heads and tearing their hair in grief. In the lower register, a procession of foot soldiers and horse-drawn chariots passes by. The figures are highly abstracted. Notice, for example, the triangular torsos of the mourners and the square frames by their arms and shoulders. The overlapping horses offer the tiniest suggestion of depth. The sculpture tradition of Greece begins with small bronze figures of horses and men in styles much like the figures on the ceramic work that we just looked at. At some point, however, Greek sculptors seem to have begun looking closely at the work of the Egyptians, with whom they were in contact. Egyptian influence is clear in this life-size statue of a young man. Not only does the work reproduce the characteristic Egyptian pose, with one leg forward and the arms at the sides, hands clenched, but it even follows the Egyptian grid system of proportions. Like Egyptian works, too, the block of the original stone was used for the sculpture and can be pictured in the squared-off appearance of the finished work. Greek concern with lifelike representation flowered fully in statues such as this bronze warrior. Here is an idealized virile male body, its anatomy distilled from observing hundreds of athletic physiques. The warrior stands in a relaxed yet vigilant contrapposto pose. The Greeks invented this to express the potential for emotion inherent in a standing human. It was thought to show the body in its most harmonious, balanced, and self-restrained, but not restricted aspect. Bronze was the favored material for freestanding sculpture in ancient Greece, yet very few examples survive today. The metal was too valuable for other purposes, especially weapons, and most ancient sculptures were melted down centuries ago. If it were not for marble copies of the bronze works commissioned by the later Romans, we would know far less about Greek art than we do today. Carved from marble and now headless, these goddesses still suggest movement. So convincing is their roundness. The drapery and the flow ripple naturally over their bodies, responding to the movement and shape of the flesh beneath. The last phase of Greek art is known as Hellenistic. Hellenistic sculpture developed in several stylistic directions. One was a continuing classical style that emphasized balance and restraint. Another overthrew classical values and more closely examined life, including human bodies that were not ideal and perfect. The Hellenistic old market woman offers a sharp contrast to the three goddesses from the Parthenon. This body shows age, not youth. It bends over to reveal weakened muscles and joints rather than to accommodate the sloping pediment. The woman is not restrained and balanced, but instead struggles with movement and the heavy burdens that she carries. For Greek viewers accustomed to seeing art depicted as youthful, strong bodies in repose, The old market woman was a striking departure. The old market woman's expressive face, with its open mouth and furrowed brow, shares characteristics with a third Hellenistic style that favored dynamic poses and extreme emotions. One of the best-known examples of this style is the Laocoon group, which we know from what is probably a Roman copy of a Greek bronze from the 2nd century BCE. The classical world. Early Greek artists were influenced by Egyptian art and its system of proportions. Early Greek artists were influenced by Egyptian art and its systems of proportions, as we see in this sculpture of Kouros. The classical world. Contrapposto helped Greek figures seem more naturalistic. Contrapposto helped Greek figures seem more naturalistic. The classical world. Greeks built post and lintel temples according to the classical orders, using various strategies to achieve pursuing visual perfection. Greeks built post and lintel temples according to classical orders. The Parthenon has been studied in greater detail than perhaps any other building in the Western tradition, for it served generations of European architects as a model of perfection. First, a repeating ratio harmonizes its dimensions. The temple is a little more than twice as long as it is wide. The exact ratio is 9:4. This same ratio appears again and again in the distance between the columns, and many of the lines we expect to be straight on the Parthenon are not. Instead, the builders adjusted the temple's physical lines so that they would look straight. For example, tall columns that were absolutely straight appear to bow inward at the center, so the columns on the Parthenon have been given a slight bulge known as enthesis to compensate for the visual effect. Also, a long horizontal line, such as the Parthenon side steps, may appear to sag in the middle. To correct this optical illusion, the steps rise about 2.5 inches at the center. To avoid the illusion that the temple leans forward, the architects of the Parthenon tilted the whole facade back slightly. They also made the corner columns slightly heavier than those in between, so that it would all appear equal. The classical world. Classical Greek art is known for its restraint, while Hellenistic Greek art focused on everyday life, dynamism, and/or emotional expression. Classical Greek art versus Hellenistic Greek art. Here's an example of classical Greek art, and we can contrast that to this example of Hellenistic Greek art. The classical world. Roman artists and architects admired and adapted forms from Greek art. Rome came of age during the Hellenistic period, when the prestige of Greek culture was at its height in ancient Mediterranean worlds. The Romans were great admirers of the Greek achievements in the arts, and many works were taken from Greece and brought to Rome. Statues and paintings were commissioned from Greek artists, and copies were made in marble of Greek bronzes and originals. The Hellenistic tendency towards realistic images, like the old market woman, inspired Roman sculptors who carved realistic portrait busts of citizens who wanted to be remembered as individuals. One such example is this marble bust of a man. The bust depicts an older man in detail, with folds in his sunken cheeks, lines on his brow, and wrinkles around his eyes. His mouth is tightly closed and unsmiling. The face communicates a strict self-discipline. Portraits like this were inspired by the wax death mask elite Romans displayed in their homes to honor their ancestors and to celebrate family lineage. Marble busts also performed a similar function, created to commemorate the virtues and service of politicians and military heroes. The Roman temple known as the Maison Curie was built in Nimes, France, shortly after it became a Roman colony during the reign of Augustus. Well preserved since its dedication in 4 CE, Maison Curie shows the typical features of Roman temples. Corinthian order columns span the front porch and support a triangular pediment. As the columns continue around the side of the temple, they become half columns, attached to the wall enclosing the temple's interior chamber. Although the columns and the pediment remind us of the Greek Parthenon, Roman builders added unique features. In addition to the enclosed sides, Romans also placed their temples on tall platforms and provided a single point of access up to the tall staircase. Like the Greeks, the Romans decorated temples like the Mesencheri with relief sculpture, as seen here in the frieze above the columns. The classical world. Romans created idealized public portraits of rulers and monuments celebrating their rulers. The Romans also erected public sculpture to honor their leaders. The portrait of Augustus Caesar pictures the first Roman emperor as a commanding general. He raises his arm in a gesture indicating speech, extending his hand as he speaks to his soldiers. His idealized body and the historical and mythological symbols surrounding him testify to his strength and leadership. The greatest honor that could be bestowed on a Roman ruler, however, was a portrayal in bronze on horseback. Equestrian statues of emperors crowned the Roman city center, their gold-covered surfaces gleaming. A description of Rome dating around 320 CE speaks of 23 such statues. Yet all of these, only a single example have survived, the statue of Marcus Aurelius. Made of cast bronze, the portrait shows the emperor seated on his mount, extending his arm, much like the statue we just saw of Augustus Caesar. His claim and his victory contrast with the spirited motion of his horse, the horse's wildness restrained by the emperor's firm command. The emperor's beard is a significant symbol and part of the way he wanted to be portrayed. Beards were associated with Greek philosophers, and here Marcus Aurelius wanted to be seen as a philosopher king, an ideal he tried to live up to. The equestrian statues of rulers and soldiers that ornament the cities around the world are direct descendants of this work. Portraits were not the only monuments to honor Roman leaders and their achievements. Sculpted images of their glorious deeds were found throughout the Roman forums, public squares accompanied by government buildings, markets, and temples. A unique public monument is the Areopagus Augustae, an altar to the Emperor Augustus' victories in Western Europe that brought peace to the empire. The wall enclosing the altar is covered in decorative, narrative, and allegorical relief sculptures. In the view seen here, the two lower panels to either side of the door present symmetrical plant motifs. A repeating geometric pattern separates the vine from the narrative scene, picturing the themes relevant to Rome's history. At the right, the mythical founder of the Roman people, a Trojan soldier named Aeneas, to whom Augustus traced his lineage, in the relief. Aeneas sacrifices a pig at the site where prophecy told him to build a city. To the left, a much damaged panel represents the descendants of Aeneas, Romulus, and Remus, who were abandoned as babies and saved by a wolf. The city of Rome is named after Romulus, who officially founded it in 753 BCE. Pairing the two scenes together made a clear statement of Augustus's illustrious ancestry and his family's service to the city of Rome and its empire. The classical world. Naturalistic mural painting and mosaic-filled Roman homes. Naturalistic mural painting and mosaics filled Roman homes. One fresco from a house known as the Villa of Mysteries shows a scene believed to represent a secret cult rituals associated with the Greek wine god Dionysius, known to the Romans as Bacchus. The figures stand as though on a ledge, in shallow but convincing space, interacting only slightly with one another. Although the artist segmented the mural into panels separated by black bands, the figures overlap these panels so freely that there is no strong sense of individual episodes or compartments. Rather, the artist has established two rhythms, one of the figures and another of the dividing bands, giving a strong sense of design unity. The classical world. Roman elite homes were organized around an open atrium with rooms for ancestral portraits, receiving guests, and dining. This image of a wealthy Roman home helps us imagine how elite Romans once lived. The main area of the house is seen in the foreground. This is the atrium, and it was open to the sky at the center, allowing light and air to enter into the home. Rooms for receiving guests, sleeping, and relaxing open off the atrium. One area within these spaces was set aside for ancestral portraits, which can be seen at the center left of this illustration. At the back of the house, a patio courtyard surrounded by columns held the dining room and the kitchen. Walls throughout the house were covered in frescoes, from narrative scenes like the cult ritual to simple painted panels that brought color and texture into the home. The classical world. The Roman round arch, vaulting, and cement created monumental architecture. For all their production in sculpture, mosaic, and painting, the Romans are best known for their architecture and engineering. The Roman round arch, vaulting, and cemented created monumental architecture, as we see here in this image of the Colosseum. These massive structures relied on the technology of the round arch, the vault, and the dome, and took advantage of concrete as a flexible and durable building material. The classical world. Roman temples altered the Greek model. Roman temples altered the Greek model. The Roman temple, known as the Maison-Curie, was built in Nimes, France, shortly after it became a Roman colony during the reign of Augustus. Well preserved since its dedication in 4 CE, Mason-Curie shows the typical features of Roman temples. Corinthian order columns span the front porch and support a triangular pediment. As the columns continue around the side of the temple, they become half columns attached to the wall, enclosing the temple's interior chamber. Although the columns and the pediment remind us of the Greek Parthenon, Roman builders added unique features. In addition to the enclosed sides, Romans also placed their temples on tall platforms and provided just a single point of access up to the tall staircase. Like the Greeks, the Romans decorated temples like the Maison-Curie with relief sculpture, as seen here in the frieze above the columns. The classical world. Roman art spread through Roman territories, and its forms were incorporated into local artistic production. By the year 100 of our Common Era, the Roman Empire ringed the entire Mediterranean Sea and stretched far from England and Spain to Egypt and Mesopotamia. This structure, known as the Treasury of the Pharaoh, was part of a large complex of tombs cut into the living rock in Petra, Jordan. For more than 2,000 miles from Rome, located on a major trade route, Petra was absorbed into the Roman Empire by the Emperor Trajan. The tombs cut into the sandstone cliffs have ornate facades carved in a variety of styles, as local artists incorporated Roman forms into their structures. An interpretation of Roman temple architecture, the lower level has a porch of Corinthian columns supporting a triangular pediment. The upper level has a round structure in the center, flanked by columns and partial pediments. Sculpted relief figures throughout the facade are today only partially visible. Like the artists at Petra, the many cultures that came under Roman rule did not cease to be themselves and suddenly become Roman. Instead, the empire extended its umbrella over a vast array of cultures, languages, and religions, all of which mingled freely under Roman rule and along Roman-built roads. At the same time, forms and ideas flowed from conquered territories back to Rome. Spirituality and beliefs from afar changed Roman religious practices, adding Egyptian and Persian gods to the Roman pantheon. However, the empire would soon turn to a completely new religion that had only recently arisen in the eastern part of the vast empire, and this was Christianity. This concludes Chapter 14.